Hi everyone, I'm Paris Chopra and today I'm with José Louis Ricón. Jose is an independent researcher who likes to get into details of lots of things. On his blog, nintil.com, among a wide range of topics, he writes about how science is done, advances in human longevity research, economics, and innovation. Peter Thiel famously said that we were promised flying cars and all we got is 140 characters, obviously hinting at the perceived sluggish rate of innovation in recent decades. Today, I'm going to pick Jose's brain on whether technological and scientific progress is indeed slowing down, and if so, what that suggests for our society's future. Welcome, Jose.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Fantastic. So, Jose, you are an independent research. Before we get into technology and technology's progress, I want you to understand, what does being an independent researcher look like? What do you actually do?
Yeah, that's a good question. So there are only a handful of people that are relatively full-time working on so-called independent research. And days can be very varied. So some days I may be talking to scientists to see exactly what their problems are, what the science actually kind of look like. I will be reading papers. I will be thinking of ideas, of things to write about. And sometimes I may just be just thinking about what should I be writing. Ultimately, I think that it matters. There is so much information out there, so many papers and so many things everyone has said. And what I'm trying to do is more or less to put some order amidst all that chaos and say, okay, well, how should we actually look at things, or what things should one focus on? So choosing what those things should be, which is ultimately it's a matter of thinking, really. It's what really occupies a lot of that time. And yes, and there are of course some, I'm right now collaborating in a relatively informal way with other relatively similarly positioned independent researchers on some projects. But it's a to some extent it's a tough role in that there is no like obvious boss telling you have to do this. After all, it's independent research, right? I'm supposed to be self-guided, but that can sometimes be quite almost emotionally difficult in that am I doing useful stuff? Am I doing enough? Am I working enough? I don't know. There's no one telling me you have to. It's okay. You have done your monthly work. It's fine. So I'm always thinking, okay, I should be working more. I should be doing more, and trying to find a balance between producing and relaxing and having a life. It's tricky sometimes.
Right. I mean, independent research is many people's dream, especially who wanted to become a researcher while growing up but never got around to pursuing this. So I'm very curious, what has been your career and how did you end up becoming an independent researcher? And also, are you doing this full-time, part-time?
Yeah. So my career, it's somewhat strange, or rather very strange. I initially wanted to write software. I was like this little kid wanted to write games and so on. So I wanted to do computer science, but my parents discouraged me from pursuing computer science, arguing that I should do a real engineering, like mechanical or aerospace or something like that. So I did mechanical engineering. And then I ended up, at that point, there was SpaceX rockets. So I thought that would be cool to move in that direction. So I ended up doing a master's in aerospace engineering. With the idea of maybe working at Rolls-Royce, designing like turbines for airplanes, and maybe transferring to the US and working at SpaceX one day or something like that. I ended up that didn't happen. And I ended up working in a car factory building electric cars. That was my first job. But then for various reasons, I didn't feel at home in that environment. I guess partially it was because it was a relatively old company. It was not fast moving. It didn't feel like the right place. So I ended up getting various other jobs in more towards software. Ultimately, the thing I really like is software, machine learning, data science. I ended up in a startup called Aiden AI eventually. That we're working for marketing analytics. Our platform was basically trying to make life for marketers easier, to enable them to manage all their marketing campaigns in one place for our platforms, and using some machine learning to actually make their life a bit easier. So then Twitter bought our company, which means that I ended up working at Twitter just because of the acquisition, and I did that for a year. And then during all this time, I had been working on this blog. So I look online or talking to people. I feel like, oh well, like there are all these very interesting questions or puzzles here and there that I don't know how they work, or I don't know what the right answer is. And then when I look at other people, I'm like, well, it seems like they're missing something. There seems like there's this evidence here and this evidence here. And I wish someone gave me like an all things considered view, integrating all these different plausible on their own pieces of evidence. So then I've been writing all these posts on my blog for a while, trying to do this. And then recently I was offered by Silicon Valley billionaire that plus the emerging ventures there's the George Washington University in the US. They have this emerging ventures grant that you can apply for. And I applied for that to kind of be able to move a bit more in this direction. So I'm managed to secure some funding to say, hey, Jose, you're doing a great job with your blog. And I think that doing that full time is probably more useful in general than, like writing code at Twitter. So I was given that money and was hired to be able to do that full time. And as I mentioned, even though yes, there's ultimately someone that's paying my salary right now, there is basically zero management. So I'm completely free to do as I please. And largely, I'm just trying to follow what I've been doing before, the same model, or only that I'm just trying to put more time into it. And yeah, so that's more or less what brings us today. And maybe if I can think of other people that are similar in that they're in this independent research kind of, or they have been in a similar position, I can think of Nadia Iqbal, Andy Matuszczak, Michael Nielsen, and Alexei Guzy from Russia.
Right. So I'm curious, you were doing very similar things part-time and now you're doing it full-time. So how would you contrast your effort and your output and your motivation between these two states?
Yeah. I mean, my output has not doubled necessarily. So it's like, so prior to this, I was more or less like half of my day was work. I think one of the good things about big tech companies, today maybe it's not that big, but the workload is lower than in startups. So when I was in a startup, I was working long hours, whereas in Twitter or at Google, for example, you don't have to work like super long. I think you can do your 9 to 5, 9 to 6, and then they're usually fine depending on the team. So that gives you a lot of time to do this thing. So then when my time to the blog roughly doubled, I didn't invest the time in just writing more. But I think I invested more in reading more and and going more in depth. So, for example, when I wrote my Fund People Not Projects series, I think I ended up reading more papers and being more detailed into what they were saying than I would have otherwise been. Similarly, I think the being able to work full time on this has also enabled me to take more meetings, talk to more people. For example, someone might say, okay, sure, I can meet with you at let's say of my local time at 3 p.m. And prior to this, I would say, well, I'm working, let's say I'm writing code for Twitter right now, so I cannot do this meeting. Now that's because it's my full-time job, I can do that. Or for example, if I want to visit, let's say some professor to talk to them about their research, prior to this, it was well, it would have to be on a weekend or at some weird time to make it work, because again, I have a full-time job, but now I can just go and do it because it's work ultimately. So yeah, this is something I've been thinking about, is should I be writing more? Should I, what topic should I write about? That's something that never left, this idea that there are so many things I could write about. For example, right now I was thinking I could continue writing on the science kind of stuff. I could focus on a different kind of issue. I was thinking of writing a blog post on the history of Alzheimer's research, kind of explaining how we got to where we are now. Apparently, a few years ago, we had this issue where people realized this thing we thought that was causing Alzheimer's, which is the accumulation of this thing called amyloid beta in the brain. Maybe it doesn't actually do it. So then the question is, how come the whole field came to believe that? From a sociological point of view, what happened for that? And lastly, another completely unrelated post, it's about homelessness. In particular, homelessness in cities like San Francisco. These are very rich, affluent cities, and yet they have huge homelessness problems. So the question is, why? What's going on? The city surely has money to address these problems. Maybe this is a theme that will come back later. I think many of the big problems right now for us socially in many countries are problems that involve not necessarily technology, but people and coordination of people and human resources ultimately.
Right. So before we move on from this topic, I know our main topic is progress, but I'm very interested in knowing your life as an independent researcher. So contrasting, in academia, you obviously have a pressure to publish papers. So there is this selection pressure for doing certain things, and in industry, you have other selection pressure. What selection pressure do you have, if any? And how does that translate into what themes you pick, and how do you sort of remain motivated as well?
Right. That's the thing that I was thinking about that the other day. Because so usually in most jobs there's a boss, there's a structure, there are tasks to do, and like you more or less for example in a software engineering job, right, that there is sometimes like a queue of tasks that you have to be doing, and you can like pick the next one, finish, pick the next one, and keep going. And here, I think it's purely relies on self-motivation. I personally, and through my whole life, I've cared about just the truth and being correct, and not trying to like fool myself. I just want a clear answer that I can explain and tell like the world as if we were telling a friend, without trying to be tricky or trying to cherry pick the evidence just to convince you. I want to write something that is honest, and that is actually the thing I would like to find in the world. I think when we find all these complex issues, I want to see in the world these like very nice explainers that, and to some extent knowing that this person that's writing them, they don't care about publishing papers, so they're not. My blog, for example, there are no ads. I don't make any. The money I make doesn't depend on if you read my blog posts or not. I think there is like no correlation between like the world and what I'm doing roughly. Like sure, you could argue that sure, maybe I'm writing things that people are more likely to read. But even then, I'm also writing about very obscure and niche topics in any case. So yeah, I think that it's mostly internally motivated, and in independent research, you have to be internally motivated, and that can be sometimes, as I said before, demoralizing, because you either have a boss, or you have a team to manage, or you have peers. But as an independent researcher, you are to some extent on your own. Sure, you can collaborate from time to time, but this sense that you get in a regular job of career advancement, career path. If you're in a PhD, for example, you know that there are fellow PhD students in your cohort, and eventually you get the PhD. You have something to look forward to, and then you graduate, and then there is a whole tenure track, and then you become a professor, and there are various interactions there. There's a structure around it which is lacking and non-existent for independent research. So it's because sometimes it's very mentally tough. This position, it's weird, right? Because it sounds like it's like in the abstract, it's an ideal job with like freedom to do anything you want to do. You can pursue any topic. There is no like adult supervision, and yet sometimes it feels kind of lonely to some extent.
Right. And especially when one reads your blog, you cover such a wide variety of topics. I was imagining, you wake up and you think of what new topic to address, because right from homelessness to longevity to economics to innovation, do you feel you're building towards something, or do you take each piece of research independently and do a job and move on to the next one?
I think I'm not deliberately like trying to kind of like fit everything into a like framework. So sometimes locally, yes. So for example, with the Fun People Not Projects series, I wrote 5 or 6 of these blog posts that more or less follow a theme, and they can be read one after the other. I've also written in the past these series of posts about the Soviet Union that again is like 7 or 8, I don't know how many wrote, but that they also form a unified whole. So there are like this series of blogs, or I also wrote these other blog posts on progress in different technologies like buildings and nuclear reactors and other things. And those you could argue those are like progress in X, kind of progress in various things. And I try to use other things. I'm just reading things that I find interesting in general that maybe they don't have to do with what I'm doing right now, just for inspiration. And sometimes I get an idea, sometimes from personal experiences. For example, I went last week, and I did a small little road trip to meet my season family up in this little town called Redding in California. And my family there, they were with the homeless. So we actually visited a homeless camp and talked to them to see it firsthand. And it was like, this is a real problem. And he was explaining to me how he spends his work day talking to them, to the homeless, how he sees things. And it was like, this seems like a very interesting problem, very important one. And I've been kind of meaning to write about this because again, it's kind of like the kind of puzzle that I kind of like at an abstract level, in that it's an important issue. It's an issue that everyone agrees that it's a problem. It's a problem that has to be, that they need help, and yet it remains. So what's going on there? So, what are the, if you wanted, for example, to solve homelessness, say in San Francisco, to give everyone a home and to make sure that they didn't fall back into that condition, what does it take? Because the resources are there, right? So that's more or less the inspiration. It's either from things I read or from my personal life, or maybe I talk to someone about something else, and then that gives me an inspiration to write something about that. And then, I think that if you want to more or less impose, there's kind of like a theme actually that you could more or less infer, that I'm not trying to follow the theme necessarily, but it kind of organically emerges, which is this idea of progress studies of okay, we want to look at the world, that there are problems, and we want to say, okay, well, mechanistically, why are these problems out there? Not just how we got to the situation, but also if we wanted to solve these problems, what's the plan to solve these problems? Which is, it's like being, I think as Patrick Collison described it once, as being like doctors of progress or doctors of business, trying to go and say, okay, well, societies are sick to some extent. How do we fix things? And here's the plan to fix those things.
Okay. So just one last detour before we come to progress studies. I know you publish your research on your own blog, and it's... traditional research is peer reviewed. So there is a lot of feedback in the sense whether you're right, whether you're not. And I think peer review sometimes also gives a sense of community. How do you get that sort of feedback, whether you're right or whether someone is finding what you're writing as valuable? I know these are two separate questions, but love to sort of.
Yeah. So, I think that luckily for me, I'm very active on Twitter. I've been always a very online person. So that whenever I publish something, I share it on Twitter, then I can see to some extent, well, is this being retweeted or liked, or do I get comments on this? So that's one way I get feedback. Also, sometimes I think that probably the best feedback is that eventually I also have this thing on Twitter where if someone ever links my blog, mintil.com, on Twitter, I get a notification. So I can see, for example, how people are using my blog posts when arguing about various things, and they will link to my blog as evidence for what it is that they are defending. And that's well, it's evidence that someone is using it or reading it and they're finding it useful. And also sometimes I get messages, for example, people in biotech, I got a message from a friend that she's starting it in a longevity company, and she was telling me that she's reading my longevity FAQ as an introduction to the field to kind of get up to speed into how that whole thing works. So kind of seeing that it's useful for people in the field as kind of the best. Or the other day, this guy on Twitter made a meme that my FAQ has supplanted the historically there was this paper that everyone uses as an introduction to longevity called the hallmarks of aging, and now people are using my FAQ, and that was the meme. It's my thing has taken over, and it's well, that means it's kind of working. Yes, I think peer reviews. I
see on your blog you have this very interesting thing where you pay people to point out mistakes.
Yeah. Yes, that's right. That's also something I use for kind of, in a way, the world is my peer reviewer. So anyone can come in and comment and say, sure, usually most people, you have to make the effort to make a comment or send me an email or something like that. So it takes an effort to incentivize that. I added this mechanism where I was well, I want to be right. I'm not, my aim is not to swindle you or to just convince you in a fakey way. I want to actually be correct. And I'm well, yes, I'm human. I make mistakes, and I know I will be making more mistakes in the future, but I want to correct those mistakes. And I think a good way is to if you want to buy corrections, you can just pay for them. So I offer these bounties on my blog post where I say, well, depending on how wrong I am, I will just pay you more or less money. And I also have this to keep myself accountable. I'm also publishing all those mistakes and how much money I've paid and to whom, so that people can see that I'm actually doing the thing. I'm actually doing what I say I'm doing. And I said, and sure, ultimately, I only get a very small number of requests of people saying, "Hey, José, you were wrong, and this thing here is the." They're usually very friendly. They are not they don't come to me in an angry way. They're "Oh, José, I really appreciate that you're doing this. Here are some mistakes you made." And I'm "Oh, thank you. Here's your $10 or whatever." So it's, to me, it's more of a it's not that the pain of having to pay money for that is motivating me. It's more of a commitment device, and also kind of a representation of the kind of to some level aesthetic that I'm aiming for, saying that, I mean, in theory, you could come to me, I mean, even if not in practice, but in theory, you could come to me and say, this whole thing is wrong, and here's the thing. And I'm prepared to actually be honest and pay for the mistakes. And also to some extent, when I'm writing, I'm thinking of, okay, well, is this something that will kind of thinking twice? Is this something that will cause me in the future to have to pay for this thing? Or should I think twice and make sure that I'm being fair and honest when judging this piece of evidence?
Right. I think it's a really strong signaling function and also forcing function for having a high standard for accuracy. And when I came across that, I absolutely loved it. And then I searched for more and I realized there is this emerging sort of term called red teams that a lot of scientists are now promoting as a way to debunk or actually try to find flaws in research, because there is this reproducibility crisis out there.
That's an interesting point. I think that it's relatively easy to fool oneself. I think I can try to be very careful and try to think about my biases, but ultimately you're like playing chess in your head against yourself. You can fool yourself very easily. But other people can see through your bullshit to some extent, and you're like, okay, well, Jose, this thing, sure, you have been thinking about a week about this, but you're still wrong, and here's why. And then you can go yes, I mean, you're right. I mean, there's sometimes things that no matter how much I think, because I can, sure, I have my techniques to avoid getting stuck in a given angle and try to see issues from different perspectives. To some extent, it's almost like building a dialogue in your head between different kind of points of view. But ultimately, having other people to tell you to give you feedback, that's very powerful, because they are coming fresh with their own angle, which you may have missed.
Yeah. Okay. So, Jose, coming to the main theme of your research, like the larger theme, progress studies, can you talk about this term called great stagnation? What is it, and why some people believe something like this exists, that we are under great stagnation?
So the great stagnation is a term that I believe was born with the economist Tyler Cowen. Might have been there before, but he wrote this book called The Great Stagnation. And the point that the book was making was that, in the original meaning, the great stagnation means that if you look at GDP growth this is mostly from as many things are, a lot of the internet is very US centric. It's the discourse. It's almost as if the US were the world. But in this case, the book talks mostly about the United States. I guess this is an interesting thing, right? Just as a little aside here, you see this in discussions around healthcare, education, culture in general. It's very much US centric. And if you're coming from a different country, you're like, well, in my country, it's not like that. What are you talking about? But they talk as if the whole world works in that way. That's Americans.
I think that's a larger theme around America, where a lot of things are generalized. Even the national sports called the World Cup for some reason.
So the great stagnation. So the point that he was making is, if you look at a long range time series of GDP growth, you see that there was not much growth up until the Industrial Revolution, and then we got exponential growth after that. If you zoom in, let's say in the period after the year 1900, 1800, say, you see, and you then decompose, okay, why does this growth happen? So the economists typically divide this growth into three components: into growth due to capital, labor, and productivity. So capital is just having more machines and having more tools to do things. Labor means having more hours of work actually being put to use. And so if you have an economy, for example, where there is lots of unemployment, you can, without changing any technology, you can just raise growth just by getting people to work, just putting more hours into work. Lastly, so productivity. So economists have this thing that they call TFP, total factor productivity. And what this is really is that if you take GDP, like the total value of the economy, and then you say, okay, well, how much can we account for of this GDP growth in terms of capital growth and labor growth, and whatever is left we call productivity. This sounds kind of sketchy, and there are people, it's not. Some people really quickly jump from a stagnation in this to a stagnation in technology. But canonically, it's not technology. It's just the residual of a regression that says, well, it's kind of a mixture of institutions and technology and interactions between other things, but it's basically everything other than labor and capital. Okay, so if we take this thing, you can have a time series in the US for labor and for capital and for this thing called TFP. So if you look at this TFP thing, it seems to be making more or less constant progress over the years until 1970. In 1970, the growth in that seems to slow down. It then speeds again around the year 2000. It speeds back again, and then it slows down again. So some people back then, this was like 20 years ago now, they were like, oh, this is great, like we're getting out of this stagnation, but actually we kind of came back into it. So the idea of this is that productivity growth has been on average slower than it was prior to 1970, and that then along with it, median wage growth in the US has also been slower. So if you look at average wage, this might be less clear because average wage you're also counting like with the very rich people. If you look at median wage, you're also like counting more towards the poorest Americans in that case, and you see that less growth there. Now, why is this worrying? So, well, why should we care about the Americans so much? Well, because the worry here is that maybe this is not just an American thing. Maybe this happens in our countries. If this is about technology stagnating, then the US is more or less at the frontier of technology. So when other countries catch up to that frontier, they're also going to stagnate, meaning that the US is kind of like a canary in the mine that's telling the whole world, hey, we have problems up here, and we have to eventually solve them. Now, very importantly, and this is was my point on that piece I wrote on narratives. The great stagnation, the idea of the great stagnation is not in itself about technology. It's about growth and productivity. And those things can come from many places. So productivity, to give you an example, suppose you have the city of San Francisco. San Francisco, it's a city, well, it's where I live. It's a city with lots of low density housing and very expensive rents. So rents here can be like very, very expensive. People may just sometimes just rent a single room because it's so expensive, right? But that situation is not because we lack some technology to make it cheaper. It's just because they don't let people build. You could build bigger buildings. So we know how to build 2, 3, 4, 5-story buildings. There is nothing stopping us from doing that other than institutions and regulations. And so in that case, you could argue that, well, that if you look at productivity in San Francisco to some extent, some of that, so if you could get more people here, more ideas, more startups, more dynamism going on, maybe you could get some growth. Okay, but that growth, that wouldn't be coming from technology, it would be coming from institutions. So then the question becomes, the stagnation in TFP and GDP are real. You can see them in the line. It's a simple number, you can see them there. But the problem is, why is that so? And people here jump to maybe this is a good segue to the problem with narratives, right? So maybe I should maybe step back and explain, maybe what is a narrative, right?
Yeah, sure.
So to me,
before
narrative
that, can
is,
so ultimately, can I just capture your conversation, like your point so far, so that I get it right? So what you're saying is this GDP growth can be explained by 3 factors, essentially: capital, which is the amount of investment we are making in terms of machinery and so on, and then labor, which is amount of effort roughly that's being put in. And if you regress that, whatever residual that comes is called total factor of productivity, TFP.
That's right. Yeah.
And if we see historically, we see TFP growing until about 1970, and then somehow it became flat. And that is the thing that usually is called as the great stagnation, right? And what you're trying to suggest is that what we are talking about is essentially productivity and not necessarily technology, because productivity could depend on multiple things and technology is one factor into it.
Yeah, and that's right. Maybe with a little caveat, which is that productivity is not fully flat. We're still improving productivity, but at a slower rate. So the worry
rate
is
has
that
flattened.
Yes, it has gone down. So TFP is still increasing, whereas productivity is still increasing, but at a slower pace than it used to.
Okay, cool. So now, what is a narrative, and why does this matters?
Yeah. So narratives are ultimately stories about the world or different parts of the world. Narratives aim to be correct in general. So narratives can be more or less true, but the point of a narrative is not to be like 100% true or to capture all the facts. They're to some extent like lenses that you can put on, or frameworks with which to look at the world and act. Some narratives may try to or typically narratives serve to reduce complexity about the world. So the world it's very complex. There are so many things going on, so many factors, so many explanations, possibilities. Narratives trying to impose some clarity on that and say, here's one way in which the world might be working. Maybe it's not the only way, but it is one way. And if you buy the narrative, then you can act based on that. So you can say, well, if this narrative is true, then so suppose, for example, that here's one concrete example of a narrative. So the economist Mariana Mazzucato wrote this book called The Entrepreneurial State. The book argues that the state, and in particular, again, going back to US centrism, the US federal government has been doing all these investments in science and technology, and that we have the internet thanks to them, and the iPhone, and various other things, and renewable energy, basically trying to make a strong case for state investment in science and technology. Now, the book is not fully accurate, and I've written a series of posts explaining that the book makes a bunch of mistakes, and that to me, it's kind of unfair. But that in a way, that's not the point. So the book, if you go to the beginning of the book says, this book, it's to some extent, it's the author herself says, this is a pamphlet. It's a pamphlet that's meant to instill political action. The point of the book is to get states to do something. The point of the book is not to be fully fair and accurate about science and technology. It's not like a boring literature review that's going through all the nitty-gritty. It's something that is telling you, it's capturing a part of a story that's needed to get a set of agents, governments, to do something. On that end, it may or may not work, but that's something one has to understand about narrative. So if you look at a narrative, you can always find what you might call like narrative violations, things that don't fit the narrative. But to some extent, that's fine. It's the same thing that when the philosopher Thomas Kuhn talks about science, he talks about this notion of like normal science and breakthrough or revolutionary science. So normal science is what scientists typically do, and science typically like accumulates a bunch of anomalies. But scientists usually say like, yeah, well, but our current theory is more or less correct, so we'll just keep going. But like anomalies accumulate, and eventually they break, and then you get a new theory or something like that. And with narratives, it might be the same. I think it might be useful to have a narrative that you can use to act, something that you can use to rally people behind the idea and then actually make some progress. Because if you don't have a narrative, you may end up in a situation where like you just have a bunch of facts and you're like, okay, well, this, but that, but this, but maybe, and you're basically end up with a bag of maybes, perhaps, and mights instead of a coherent whole that you can use. So narratives are at the same time powerful but dangerous in that you can risk oversimplifying reality, and through that you can then the solutions you may end up proposing or your analysis may actually be biased. I think that narratives should start with the like very fine-grained observations about the world, and there's this kind of play between should you try to be very expansive, and if there are, I think, how many anomalies should you tolerate when you are building a narrative? Should you just like if you have lots of them, it's like, well, it doesn't matter, we don't have a better narrative? Or should you instead like wait before having a narrative and then just like look at the individual facts and then maybe later a narrative will emerge?
Right. Yeah. So a lot of narratives are sort of looking at the past and telling a story. Do you feel narratives should also be predictive of future? I mean, scientific theories obviously make falsifiable predictions, but I'm not sure whether narratives do it or whether they should do it.
Yeah. So actually there are some here, and I can think, for example, so it to some extent it's a bit of it's somewhat ironic, but if you look maybe 10 years ago, one very predominant narrative, at least here in Silicon Valley, was this idea of the singularity. This idea that actually progress is actually speeding up. It's completely. Almost everything is speeding up. Everything is great. We're going to get like super smart AI soon, and everything is going to change and so on. So the singularity people, they also made predictions for by the year 2030 we're going to have this, by the year 2040 we're going to have these technologies, and we see VR and AR and like various technologies going into the future and how these are going to change society. I think that to some extent that's important, and some people, for example, you probably know Balaji Srinivasan, the VC. Right. So he said at one point that science fiction, it's like a blueprint for the future. Science fiction tells you how things could be, and then it's like, okay, well, if things could be in that way, once you see a possible future, then you can start thinking backwards. It's like, okay, this future is good. How do we get there? So I think that some narratives they try to explain how we got here, and others try to say, okay, this is where we are. Where there are yet other narratives that say, okay, well, this is where we could be going in the future. Yeah.
Right. So this narrative about technology stagnating, why is it not true? And maybe the statement is also binary, but what's your view on this? I know you've talked about this, written about this. Is there a great stagnation or is there not?
Yeah, so the reason I've said a couple of times that there is not is that the term itself, with the stagnation, makes you think that, because of the word grade, that everything is stagnating, and there is a structural problem in kind of everywhere, really, that nothing should be making progress, that everything in general is stagnating. But that's not true, and there are some examples of this. Now, some people in the great stagnation kind of side, they will make distinction between atoms and bits. They will say that, sure, we're making progress in software and like apps, but not in the quote things that maybe matter in manufacturing and actual physical items and things like that. Even on those grounds, that is not, well, it's like one, I think that idea is not completely fair. That is, for example, when Peter Thiel famously said, we want flying cars and we got 140 characters, I think 140 characters are pretty great. They are.
Yeah, I love it.
Yes, it's a great thing. So it's like, sure, it's not a flying car, but it's kind of nice, actually. It's kind of nice that we have something like Twitter. I've been able to meet lots of great friends and get jobs thanks to Twitter, and I get lots of information from there. I think that if I had a flying car parked here in my backyard, I think Twitter will still be making a greater difference to my life than a flying car. So I think that we should not just hastily discount the software, or even, for example, things like food delivery or like online banking. They make life way nicer than it used to be, and sure, I mean, it maybe doesn't. If you are coming from, let's say, the 70s or 80s with expectations that if you were watching a Star Trek and you were thinking about these spaceships and like warp drives and this very hard tech sci-fi stuff, maybe you feel disappointed that we don't have flying cars or spaceships yet. But we have made lots of genuine progress. We should start by acknowledging that we have all made actual, real, tangible progress that makes real difference to human welfare, and then look at the other things. Now, on the atoms side. And here, it's not even true that everything is stacked. Like you can point to many things that are pretty much physical and hard tech that are making lots of progress. If you look, for example, at here's one. This is more organizational to some extent, but if you look at the capacity factor of nuclear reactors, this is a nuclear reactor produces this much energy per hour. And it could produce, in theory, if it were running the whole year, it could produce this much energy. So the capacity factor is the ratio between how much it's produced and how much it could produce. So 100% means it's fully used. So that began at like 70 or 50% when maybe in the 70s, and now it's close to 90 or something percent. For the same reactors, we have made improvements in processes to actually just get more. It's almost like doubling our energy for free. That's a good example of productivity. But not only that, we can also point to everything from the efficiency of steam turbines. And steam turbines matter because we use them for coal power plants, gas, nuclear. So ultimately, it sounds nuclear reactors may sound very kind of advanced, but ultimately they are heating up steam to get a turbine to spin. That's not there. So you want the turbine to be efficient. Solar panels have also become very cheap. Batteries have also gotten so cheap and light that we can actually build electric cars, and not only electric cars, but also to some extent, people are working now on electric planes. And similarly, the batteries may also be enabling the famous flying cars to actually come at last. And also even in airplanes. So you may say, well, airplanes are not flying faster than they used to. Well, there are now startups working on super and hypersonic propulsion, and even if this is just a promise for the future, if you look at the past, airplanes used to be very noisy and also very inefficient. They consumed a lot of fuel, and now airplanes can fly further, consuming less fuel, which is also a great advance. So these are like all things that are kind of very, these are as hard tech as you can possibly get. And yet here we are seeing, we don't see, when you look at the trends, you don't see like everything improve and then 70 and then we get stuck there. That did happen. The field where I think this is most clear, maybe to add one example, semiconductors. This year, maybe to some extent last year, we got two things that were huge breakthroughs. We got the new Zen 3 chips from AMD. So Intel had been dominating the whole field for a long time, and we got these chips that are extremely fast, lots of cores, and maybe more importantly, the Apple M1. The Apple M1 it's a surprising marvel of a machine. I'm using now this new M1 MacBooks, but it basically set a new standard of speed and efficiency, like kind of like expanding the kind of envelope of what we could do. and this will keep improving. Like people, if you take even Moore's law, so sure, maybe Moore's law is not going as fast as it used to, but it's still going quite fast. And with things like the M1, you can see that there is still lots of progress we can keep making on semiconductors. And if you talk to people in the industry, I got the chance to talk to chip architects at Intel once. The pipeline is full. There are innovations coming. They have not run out of ideas. We're still getting. There's still the frontiers of semiconductors remain unexplored, and we're making progress there. And if you want to point to one field that is making or that's making progress in the most clear way, that's the life sciences. Biology, to me, if there is one endless frontier, that is biology. We're making almost like class-defining breakthroughs almost every month or every year in almost all parts of biology. Like things like being able to detect cancer, doing like a blood test and then detecting cancer from your blood. That's completely bonkers. Like, or having, for example, Apple is going to release this continuous glucose monitor that it works by it shines a light through your, I think you're wearing the Apple Watch, say, and it's shining a light through your arm, and then the light comes back. And apparently, just from that, you can tell how much glucose is in your blood. Wow. It's like, isn't it bonkers that this works? But ultimately, it's like, how on earth is it possible? We have this also. If you look at cancer survival, we have improved in a lot of cancer. So back in the day, if you had something like leukemia or some of these cancers, you would most likely die, or very high chance of die. Now, maybe 90% of people that survive more than 5 years. Sure, some cancers are still not cured, but we're in a way better position than we used to. And the thing is that, given that we're discovering so many things every month about biology, it means that we will probably keep going. There are so many things we don't know, which means that we can probably those things that right now we don't know how to do. We may actually find a way to do them. For this idea, for example, that right now we don't know exactly how to reverse aging, but it seems like we should be able to. It's like there are so many potential avenues you could explore to try to do so. It's not like physics tells you, oh, this is not doable. It's not quite like that. It truly feels like almost like being in the American like Wild West, where everything is up for grabs and to explore and to finding new things all the time. So I think that if anyone is pessimistic about progress, you should definitely, it's like maybe you should write one post about this, like all the progress we made just in 2020 in biology, like everything we have learned. It's like, whoa, actually things are happening. And
even for like the SpaceX, we've flown and gotten huge rockets back in reusable form.
Yeah, exactly.
And all that has happened after 1970, of course.
Yeah, and it's also a very even from a societal point of view. I still remember when the space shuttle was like taking off and landing, and now seeing the rockets like land back into it feels that kind of similar moment where it's like, wow, like we can actually do cool stuff. Look at those things, and it's like, oh, engineering is cool, and yes, like or even Tesla cars. So Teslas. I was when I went the other day to meet my family, I rented a Tesla, and one is that they are just nice. They're fun to drive. I think they are not just gas cars, but clean. They're actually nicer to drive. The acceleration, how they take curves, and the whole experience, and the autopilot, everything. It's a really super experience. And when I got the kids to see a Tesla, they were so impressed, and they were like, yeah, when I grow up, I want to make these things. And that's really inspiring to see exactly the fruits of human ingenuity in front of you. That's really inspiring, kind of, for the next generation of engineers that will have to go and say, okay, we are not done. We're still making progress. We can keep making progress. Let's go and do it.
Right. So, Jose, we've made so much progress, like you've pointed out. But back to TFP, whatever it suggests, why that might be slowing down. One of the reasons you said maybe regulation. But how do you sort of view it from, and what is it really saying, and how should we interpret it?
Yeah. So the whole the number of reasons why TFP might be slowing down, it's varied. One is technology could be slowing down. It could also be that institutionally the technology is there, but it's not being translated into products that it can be put to use. It can also be that sectors that are less productive or that have been historically less productive are now becoming bigger parts of the economy than they used to. For example, suppose that there are two sectors in an economy. One is manufacturing cars, and the other one is education. And let's say that the productivity of making cars improves at a constant rate. and the productivity of education improves at a slower rate. Now, if education expands with the economy, if you look at the aggregate, it's going to look like productivity is going down, but that's just because education is taking over. So now, on average, the economy is more like education-based. And this is a pattern that I think it's part of the explanation. So if you look at what are, again, going back to the US, if you look at what are bigger parts of the US economy, that's education and healthcare. That's our big parts of the US economy, and also to some extent politics. And these are all sectors that are very human capital intensive. These are in an assembly line. So in an assembly line, you can multiply, you can make the assembly line go 10 times faster and have robots and and do things in parallel. With humans, you cannot, if you're, let's say, building a building or laying some bricks, you cannot lay the bricks 10 times faster. Like your arms can only, or if you're a surgeon, you cannot do surgeries like super fast because you have to be focusing and so on. So we have this challenge where we have these sectors that have been very traditional and very conservative and resistant to change, education and healthcare. And the challenge now, to me, I think if we need innovations to actually see that TFP going up, is actually we should be thinking about those sectors. And here I wanted to bring an example from India that I came across many years ago. Well, there might be two of these, but the one I'm thinking about is a hospital chain called Aravind Eye Hospitals from the state of Tamil Nadu. I don't know if I pronounced Tamil Nadu right.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So this thing, basically, that this chain of hospitals, this was founded by this guy called Dr. Govindappa Venkataswamy at this city called Madurai. And basically, it's like, he was like, well, McDonald's are so efficient. Can we build like a McDonald's of healthcare? And so he was like, okay, how can we streamline processes so that we can actually do eye surgery in a super efficient, fast way? And what the results are like even controlling for like labor costs, because sure, it's not as expensive to hire a surgeon in India versus in the US. But even if you control for that, you get cheaper and surgery, and at the same quality levels than US hospitals. There is this international panel that does accreditations, and these hospitals are like top tier at what they do, but they are super cheap. Now, how did they do that? And they did this purely through organizational methods. They apparently improved a lot how, let's say, if you have a surgeon, you can have that surgeon do a specific kind of surgery and or a part of a surgery, and then they move to a different room and they do the same thing over and over and over to try to get them to be super good at the one thing. Okay. And also just to having, I think that, it's almost like an assembly line of medicine. Yeah. So I think this comes to show that like there are different ways that we can actually make progress in these kind of things. So that then the question becomes, okay, what would it take to import this model from India into the US, for example? Or is there any regulation that if you wanted to do this, they will say like, oh, you can't do that because of maybe there is some regulation there that prohibits from doing that. Similarly, there is if you look at construction. So construction speeds for skyscrapers, this post, if you look at how fast was the Empire State Building built back in the, I think it was like 1920s or so, it was built very fast. But if you look at speed, it has been mostly flat for the last almost 80 years or the last century. But if you look at this, there is this company in China that they basically prefabricate the different floors of the building, and then they assemble them. So they can build like 40-story buildings in like months instead of like 3 years. That's like 100x faster than what we used to, or something like that. And it's like, okay, well, we have the technology now. Why is this not being used? So then that gets into the maybe into the politics game or the organizational game. One is, maybe people are just not thinking about this. Maybe it's like, people don't know about this, that these things are even possible. Maybe they are just stuck in the old framework, or maybe there is genuinely a regulatory issue that maybe like a small, like maybe it's like subsection 3.4 of section 341 of the US Gov. There is some obscure thing that says that this thing is actually not workable. So then the question becomes, okay, as a business person that sees this problem, I want to have this regulation change. But then you have to talk to the House subcommittee in building or whatever. So you have to convince those people to actually change that. So you get into this interplay between to be able to deploy the technology, you need to make some changes at the political level. So, and that gets us into that maybe the real drag for the economy. It's not that technology is not being produced at the rate as it used to, but it's that politics is preventing things from actually moving faster. Also, if you look at the COVID vaccine deployment in the US, we could have gone faster. But it was mostly an institutional problem. The vaccines were there, the technology to make them was there, but what failed was the supply chain and regulatory aspects of the process.
Right. And this question of productivity and efficiency, why does this matter in the big scheme of things? Why should we care about it, whether it's slowing down or going fast?
So the one, maybe if there is one reason to care about this, is to some extent that if we want to increase, ultimately there are, maybe to put it in very philosophical terms, ultimately we all want different things. We all want like houses and even video games and to have a clean environment. Like there are so many goals that many people have. If we have lots of resources, everyone can do whatever it is that they want to do. We don't have to fight for resources. Everyone has their own share of the pie. So if you have an ever-increasing economy, then everyone is kind of happy. Sure, you may argue about like we should give more money to this or money to that, but if everyone has enough, then it becomes less of an issue. So economic growth matters. And to get economic growth, as I mentioned, you need labor, capital, and productivity. Now, labor, is that you need to get people to have more kids, which is also gets into another part of the problem that many nations are experiencing a slowdown in the rate of population growth. And less population means less workers, more like retirees that need to be supported by the rest, less people having ideas. Ultimately, if you have fewer people, you have and also usually like older societies, when you're older, you have less energy. You want to move, let's say, try new things out because you're more or less settled in your ways. So having more younger people is a good thing for growth. So you can increase labor to some extent. But productivity is basically the fountain of growth that kind of it's almost semi-inexhaustible, and you can just like keep with the same amount of work and the same amount of capital, you can just do more things. If you take, for example, semiconductors. Well, semiconductors is basically a bunch of sand. It's silicon. Ultimately, it's silicon crafted in nice ways. It's the same silicon that you can see in the desert. But it's doing more interesting things now once you put that productivity onto it. Or the M1 chip from Apple. It's the effort to make it is not so different from making other chips. The design that went into making it. The idea, ultimately, the abstract idea that went into that was then realized in a physical design, it's what actually makes it so powerful. So ultimately, that's why ultimately we care about everyone being able to fulfill their goals, so we don't have to fight about things. So we care about economic growth. One strong engine for economic growth is productivity growth. So ultimately, that's the reason why we want to have as much of that as possible.
Right. So I was reading somewhere, and I think you've also mentioned in your blog, even though, say, technology has been progressing, it feels like the cost for that technology progress is also increasing. So, for example, in pharmaceuticals, there is this reverse of Moore's law called Irum's law, where the cost of new approved drug doubles every sort of 2 years or so. And similarly, you've written about end of science, where we perhaps have discovered a lot of our everyday science. So what are your sort of views on this? And also, I was reading a blog. I think someone has done research that the number of researchers has been increasing, but the number of total output has been more or less same for last many decades.
Yeah, so on that, when I wrote this, I wrote these articles that are something like they're not the end of science. It's more the end of fundamental physics in particular. So the idea here is that, well, science is not like a unified thing. There are many fields within science. And even though I do think that biology is making lots of progress, I also think that maybe physics it's kind of really stuck. And one has to be open to the possibility that actually for that particular case, we are at the end of the road. That sure, there are still problems to be solved, like unifying quantum mechanics and general relativity, for example. But it's like, when are we getting the warp drives to go faster than light? Now, the odds that we're going to get that I would see them as lower than the odds that, let's say, we're going to cure all disease. I think that's probably going to happen. But that was kind of making the point that that one can be maybe going back to the narratives idea that you can be very, very bullish and very optimistic about some areas and very relatively more pessimistic about others. And I think that that's more of a fair judgment. Instead of saying everything is stagnating, it's like, well, some things truly are. I mean, I don't deny that, but other things are actually making genuine progress. And then, so I think, but actually acknowledging that then leads us to say, okay, well, if this is true, so maybe the reason why physics is not making progress is not the same reason why we're not making progress elsewhere. Maybe physics is genuinely, we have picked the lower hanging fruits, but elsewhere the problem might be regulatory. So if we know exactly what the different problems in different areas are, we can then begin to think of solutions for those problems. Maybe there is no easy solution for physics because genuinely we understand nature very well right now, whereas in biology, we don't. Yeah, I think you were asking, I think, something else before.
I was asking, the number of scientific researchers has grown exponentially, but the economic growth has been more or less similar. You would expect with more input to science, you would get more output that ultimately translates into economic growth, but that hasn't happened over the last many decades. I guess it's similar to what you've been talking about, but.
Yes, I also mentioned the Ehrum's law, the example of Ehrum's law. I think interestingly, from in the last, I think, 10 years, we have seen that Ehrum's law has broken down at last. So the cost, instead of getting worse, it has gotten, it's flat now. So it has stopped getting worse in the last 10 years, which is a bit of a good thing. But I think that to some extent, it's like, why do drugs cost so much? Or to some extent, some of it is because maybe we lack the right. I think it's not like an intrinsic feature of drug development that they have to be so expensive. Maybe we lack the right tools or the right models to think about these things thoroughly. So this is part of the work I've been thinking about with others. That if you could find a tool or build something that could unstack the whole shit, some public good that pharma is not going to fund, but that could greatly accelerate drug development, what might that be? For example, I guess if you wanted to have drugs for cholesterol, for a cardiovascular disease, and imagine having to wait, let's say, 50 years for everyone in your cohort to die, so you can measure exactly the effect between the control and the treatment group. But instead, you can look at LDL cholesterol. Did LDL cholesterol went up or down? And then you can use that as a marker for the disease. So you can wait less. The trial is cheaper, and then you can get more drugs at a lower cost. So maybe we need to do more work in finding these useful biomarkers for drugs. So it's not kind of set in stone. On the more researchers, yes, there are more researchers than ever before. We are seeing, so historically it was basically dominated by countries like France and Germany. Then you got the US, and now we're getting more and more researchers coming from China and India joining the worldwide research community. But it's like, the thing is, if you look at progress in various areas, and actually the paper that was talking about that, incidentally, it does not claim that progress is slowing down. It's just like, well, progress is going as it always has, but we're needing more resources to get there. Now, part of the reason why that might be, I more or less hinted at this on one of my posts on this science on my Fun People Not Project series, is that maybe most scientists are not doing work that's actually going towards furthering an engineering field. It might be that many of these scientists are generating knowledge that is valuable for its own sake, into like expanding what we know as a species, but maybe it's not directly useful. So maybe if you could, this is the idea, is that maybe if you could, let's say, cut scientists in half, so you have half the amount of scientists, maybe you could pay them more to the ones you have. Maybe if you do that, you end up with that actually progress continues in the same way. It's that we're just adding more scientists into the mix. In turn, this might be because back in the day, science was a relatively elitist occupation. It was only a few people that could get into a system. And now it's more democratized. It's open to more people. So more people can actually spend time in academia doing research, which is good in that now they have that opportunity. But at the same time, instead of having only the brightest minds working in industry, in science, now you have lots of other people that maybe they are not contributing as directly to that. So it's a trade-off that you have to make. Is that maybe we're seeing slower progress in some technologies, but also maybe due to having more people, we're maybe going to make more breakthroughs in the future with newer fields that we don't know. Because when you're looking at when you're studying technology, you can do two things. You can take a technology and that has a given trend, like let's say a cost of a kilowatt hour of batteries, and you can see that trend. But you can also look at like new technologies. Like you can look at like new things that we're inventing and exploring. So it's not clear to me that we have to be spending so many resources on the science. We just happen to be. But I'm not too worried that the fact that we have I think the biggest worry is at the top level, are we still making progress? Because ultimately science is not that expensive. So we can just keep putting resources onto that. But at the same time, we should also be thinking, what is the most efficient way of using our resources here? As in, if we have, let's say 3% or 2% of GDP to do science, or more, what's the best structure for this? And then if we need more, well, maybe we need more, but we should, going back to the efficiency side, you can always ask of any problem, can we do it better than we're doing now?
Right. It does seem strange that, given that population has grown tremendously over the last decades and we have more cumulative knowledge, the rate of economy has been more or less constant. You would naively expect rate to go up if there are more people with more ideas and the breadth of knowledge being more, but the world GDP has been not significantly on the upward trend.
Yeah, I also interestingly wrote this older article that I called on the constancy of US GDP growth. If you look at the grand scheme of things, so from the year 1800 to now, it seems that no matter if there are wars, no matter what political parties in power, no matter what happens, it seems kind of going on autopilot, less going up. And sure, maybe we are in the greatest stagnation on that chart shows us as a little blip, which is kind of what's going on here. And I tried to explain that some of this is driven by factors that are relatively constant. For example, if you think of labor as a component of GDP, so if you wanted to see a bump in that trend, you have people suddenly going from having 2 kids to having like 20 kids in one generation. That doesn't usually happen like that. Changes happen more slowly, which means that the trend will also change slower. So you can see this exponential in the end. So this is the thing that with productivity growth, or with exponentials rather, what matters. If you have 2 exponentials, they may look similar, at least initially. So even if it's slowing down, exponential. If we can still maintain exponential growth in GDP, that's still a great thing. Because to put it in a different way, if you look at again with the US, because obviously other countries like India, China, and Africa that are growing way faster than the US, luckily. But if you look at the US, it's like, okay, the US is like year on year, it's growing at slower than it used to, let's say in the 1960s. But on absolute terms, the amount of resources are being added every year, that's greater than ever before on absolute terms. Right. And that's great. That's a great thing as well. It's not like we are running out of growth or we're completely flat. We're still making progress. The important thing is saying we could always be doing more. I think this is important, that even if we could make productivity and growth and everything look the same as it used to prior to 1970, even then we could still say, okay, but we can do it better. We can always keep thinking, okay, why should we take pre-1970 the figure that's given? Why not more? We should always keep wanting for or aiming for efficiency across everything we are doing, and continue to find problems and solve them across all the areas.
So on this, connecting to the topic of narratives, when you see a curve like Moore's law or Erum's law or this constant growth of GDP, there is this tendency to assume this will happen by itself. But when it finally breaks, when Moore's law breaks, Erum's law, it seems that ultimately this is a function of people and ideas. So so what's your first reaction when you see such like a sociological trend or law?
They're actually quite mysterious to some extent. If you look at Moore's law, so the real Moore's law was something about like the doubling of the density in chips every, I think, 5 or 7 years, I think it was. And the thing is, okay, that trend more or less has continued. The thing is, why? Why has it been so constant? Why? Because it could be like it accelerates and it slows down and it continues. why? I don't have a clear answer to that, to be honest. It's an interesting it's kind of like an interesting fact of life that many technologies evolve along this more or less logistic curve. There is a period of slow growth, then a period of constant growth, and then they slow down, and then they are replaced by a different kind of technology. So, for example, if you look at the speed of propeller aircraft, well, those ones got faster up to one point, and then they got stuck there. But then we got jet aircraft, which then go even faster, and then we'll get supersonic aircraft and hypersonic aircraft. And maybe Elon Musk is now talking about using a Starship to actually go. You can take off in a Starship and then land anywhere else on Earth into like 2 hours. So that's the thing, that the common trend, that progress is made of overlapping logistic curves, where you find a new paradigm and then you exploit the new paradigm, and then you find a new paradigm and then you exploit that, and then you keep going. So, for example, the fact that Moore's law is going, but not as fast as it used to, it just means that, well, maybe in the future we'll just find something else. We can do computations with light. There's research on doing this thing called adiabatic computation, which is using computers that don't generate heat when they operate, and with less heat, you don't need that. You can actually improve also the efficiency of the computers. There's quantum computing also as well. So there are like now right now, even if growth seems kind of sluggish, there is a case to be made for, there are so many things happening right now that will bear fruit in a few years, that I would not be surprised if in 10, 20 years in the future, in the same way that it happened in the year 2000, we see productivity growth just like going fast again in 20 years, because all the work that's being done right now.
Right. I mean, venture capitalists and investment community, they famously use these laws to invest and hope that things will bear fruit. But it's always seemed mysterious to me, because technology seems to be a very people enterprise. So having these natural looking laws just is baffling that they should exist.
It's very weird indeed. And I was thinking once about what's a good way of thinking about, or rather a satisfying explanation for why do these trends look like the way they look like. It's like, there is one case where I can see more or less why they might look like this. If you look, for example, at mining, if you're, for example, mining for gold in a gold mine, well, at first you find some gold and it's easy because it's on the surface, and then you keep going, and then it becomes harder and harder. So initially maybe it's harder, but you find more and more and more and more gold, and then eventually there is almost nothing left. So you have to make a lot of effort to get there. This also happens in oil. So you find this very natural, like almost like a Gaussian curve, where you like see slow improvement, then it peaks and then it goes down. So that model makes intuitive sense to me for like oil and mining in a very mechanical way, easy to understand. So maybe it's the same for technology, although of course it doesn't feel the analogy as immediate, because technology is more complex than just like a fixed oil field that you're just exploiting and there is a finite amount of it. But maybe there is something to that initially it's very easy to find ideas in one field. Like anything you do, it leads to something, and then it becomes harder and harder, and then it's exhausted, and you have to find a new field to exploit. And then if you overlap all this kind of Gaussian kind of exploitations of a field, you end up with this exponential growth compounding over time. So that's maybe my best guess of what's going on.
Right. But what seems strange is that there's always a new paradigm just around the corner. I would imagine that, you could exhaust by exploiting low-hanging fruits and things become difficult later on. But it always seems there is the next creative paradigm that takes you beyond that curve. That is the strange part for me.
Yeah, I guess that's the difficult part, is that because you could say in physics, you could say maybe so if you go back to the 1800s, prior to the revolution to modern physics, prior to quantum mechanics. People were saying physics is over. We already know everything, and now what's left is just like putting decimals in the last number of the equations, and everything is done. And actually, even Max Planck, who was the father of the idea of the quantization of energy, his professor told him, "Don't go into physics. It's done. It's a dead field. There's nothing to do here." But he was wrong, of course. And actually, we got all this progress happening in the course of a century. Now, some people argue maybe it's the same right now. Maybe we're just waiting until the next thing comes through. And actually, in the same way that people did not imagine that you could use that you would need relativity, let's say, to correct for to make GPS positioning systems. So maybe we can actually build warp drives and go to like stars far away, even though we don't know how to build them right now, and even though current physics tells you it's impossible or near impossible to do it. But if we are very wrong or very deeply wrong about the way physics works, maybe actually we can do those things. So it's always this place that it's like, how can we ever be sure that the field is truly closed and over? My heuristic, the only thing I found as a good heuristic is the field making a lot of progress fast? I think if a field is making progress right now, I expect it will continue into the future, kind of like a very naive linear extrapolation. I'm sure maybe we'll get surprises in fields that seem stagnant. I think, for example, aviation will be a good example of this, in that, well, after the Concorde, the maximum speed of airliners have been more or less flat since 1970, 1960, almost flying at the same speed. But I also think that we are going to see soon a change in that trend. Instead of like seeing a constant progress, we're going to see a bump up to supersonic and maybe later hypersonic speeds. I think that's being worked on. So it's like, well, in this case, I would say just because the field is flat and seemingly not making, or like at least naively not making progress because it's flat, there's lots of work going on there to actually make it bump in the future.
Right. So Jose, since we are at the end of our conversation, I wanted to ask you a question that on Twitter you said you wish somebody would ask in one of your podcasts. I wanted to ask, what have you changed your mind on? You worked on so much. So what did you used to believe that you don't believe anymore, or vice versa?
Oh, that's a good question. There are a bunch of obscure niche topics and others that are more innovation related. One that's innovation related. I used to think that specific individual innovators were probably not that important. That that if you, for example, if Elon Musk hadn't been born, we will still have spaceships or something. Because someone else would have gotten the idea. Yeah. I think that is not true. I think that individuals matter. I think that having those, you can say the same thing about Einstein or Nikola Tesla, in that I don't think that they will stop progress forever, but I think that specific people can make an actual difference and impact to progress, that they can accelerate or make things happen, let's say 10, 20, 50 years before anyone else comes up with the idea. So actually making sure that the right people are working on the right things and enabling these kind of creators and makers to actually be able to do what it is that they want to do is very important. That we are not at the mercy of the large trends of history that will get just gone onto pilot. I think individuals matter. That's one. Another one, maybe this is fairly obscure and completely unrelated to the progress thing, but back then when I was way younger, I used to believe that the way modern banking works, there's this idea of fractional reserve banking. This is the idea that, well, right, banks, if you put money in the bank, they will loan the money, and if you go to the bank, well, the money is not there. It's not fully there. They only keep a fraction of the money. This is called fractional reserve banking. And I used to think that there is something wrong with this. Now I think it's fine, but it's not fully fine in that there is actually a kernel of truth to that view, which is that even though it's fine, ultimately the bank you're getting the bank is not misleading you into making you think the money is there. The bank is just promising you that you're going to if you're going to pay with the money is going to be there, and they can make good on that promise if they manage the resources carefully. But the thing I end up thinking is true is that that works well systemically only if the assets that the banks are holding are relatively safe and matched with the liabilities they have. What does this mean? This means that if you're putting money on a bank as a short-term deposit, that those assets should probably be like short, either just cash or like short-term commercial paper. That money should not go into like speculative mortgages or industrial bonds or like very long-term things. That creates a mismatch between your desire to save and what the bank is actually investing on. That kind of mismatch, I think it's part of why we get economic crisis. So in a way, that change of mind was coming from a view of maybe the baseline view is banks are fine. Then you have the view of like, actually this being able to loan money that you're depositing is a bad thing, to my last view, which is actually it's fine that they do that, but that they should be more careful with how they do it. Other things, I think I also used to be more of a like private property fundamentalist into like I used to like, because it's an interesting design problem, right? If you could have like a city where everyone owns like the chunk of a street, and like everyone owns their own pipe, and then everyone kind of could cooperate together in a very free market way, I would kind of cool in that you look at that, it's like, oh, this thing works. There's so much cooperation going on here to make this work, but actually it probably wouldn't work. I think that some resources do benefit from common ownership, but if you have like a river, it makes sense that the whole river is managed as a unit, because it's so interconnected, as in ultimately it's the same water flowing through the river. Or if you have irrigation canals in an agricultural area, you probably want to have some, it doesn't have to be a state entity. Actually, the work of the economist Elinor Ostrom was very influential here about having like bottom-up institutions to actually manage these kind of resources to kind of avoid this tragedy of the commons that you get from individual kind of private property. Maybe one more that I got is that I used to think that kind of marketing was to some extent sneaky and like a bad thing, as in you're trying to swindle people into buying your product in kind of using dirty tactics. But I actually think that marketing is a very useful thing. Partly, I guess, through working in that industry, working in ad tech. Ultimately, with marketing, you're trying to help people discover what they didn't know they wanted. Like if you look at, for example, people, I think that they are genuinely better off with things like iPhones or smartphones, but people didn't know they wanted an iPhone until they saw one. So it's like making this like where it's like, hey, this is the thing that you then thought you may want, that actually you may genuinely want for good reasons. And also just making people aware that, hey, like you could, like this thing that you are, for example, I found out about this brand called Allbirds, about the sneakers that I like too. And they are just very nice and very comfortable, and they are great. And I went back to kind of other shoes, and I only found out about this because I got an ad targeted to me. So people may creep out about like, oh, but they're collecting our data and they're using for ads. But I think that's not necessarily a bad thing, that you can use that information for targeting. And actually, if marketing works in an ideal world, marketing works in an unobtrusive way that really surfaces things that you honestly like. So it doesn't have to be like subliminal or sneaky in any way. It's just honestly putting out your product into the world and making the right people know about it. And maybe see if I can find one more. Maybe one of the more recent ones, the idea of narratives. I used to be more pessimistic about narratives in the past. Partly because I think that narratives can be and are dangerous, in that they can mislead you and make you think that the narrative is everything there is. But actually, now I recognize that narratives can be useful and powerful and not like necessarily dangerous in a bad way. I think if you want to change public opinion, to affect political change, and even just like for the work you are doing, to kind of to tell yourself a story about this is who I am and this is what I'm doing, for like to reduce your uncertainty about how the world works. A good narrative, in the same sense that all models are wrong, but some models are better than others. Narratives work in the same way. I think that they're okay, but we have to know exactly their limitations, but also the benefits.
Right. So this has been a fantastic conversation, Jose. Thank you once again for your time. I recommend all the listeners to go to your blog, nintil.com, and I hope you continue to produce excellent research pieces on your blog. I keep frequenting them, and I love what you do.
Yeah, thank you. It's great to be here.
Thank you. Bye-bye, and have a great day ahead.
Goodbye. Have a good day.